Hello and welcome to the Joyscape Therapy podcast turned YouTube, where we discuss everyday behaviors for everyday people. I'm your host, Maryssa Mckenzie. I'm a board certified behavior analyst. You'll hear that referred to as BCBA for those of you that are unfamiliar. As a reminder, we do offer one continued education unit as Joyscape Therapy is an ACE provider. Join us as we review details or findings from research, disseminate that research and how it applies to our everyday jobs and sometimes the broader range of life, making these concepts relatable, relevant, and educational. Please listen in until the end of this episode to obtain the code words for today. And if you enjoy today's episode, please like and subscribe for more content. You can follow us on social media at Joyscape Therapy. So today's topic and guests, we'll be discussing board certified assistant behavior analyst to a BCBA, and what is a BCABA? How is the certification different than that of a BCBA? And some of the pros and cons, and we'll be talking with individuals who have actually been certified as a BCABA in the past, and we'll see kind of just their experience and we'll get a little bit of their insights. So I'm really excited to jump into their stories. So without further ado, I want to introduce to Kathryn Estrada and Michael Quan.
Hello, and thank you for having us.
Hello.
Yes, thanks for being on. So tell us a little bit about yourselves.
I'm Kat. I am now a BCBA, formerly a BCABA. I'm kind of into the plants. You can see a little behind me. I've almost been a BCBA for a full year now, so that's my biggest recent accomplishment, just getting used to filling these shoes. Been in the field since 2016. I was actually trained by Michael as an RBT.
Nice. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Cool fact.
And then I'm Michael. I've been in the field for, I think in August, it'll be almost 11 years. I have, and Kat too, we've both had the RBT credential, BCABA, and then to BCBA. And then I am almost at a year two. Fun fact, I'm pretty sure our numbers like differentiate by literally just one number, which I think is kind of cool. I was gonna joke too. I think Kat and I are probably into the similar things. I'm also into plants.
Yeah.
Dog a lot. And then actually both of us picked up roller skating. Don't ask us the last time we've done it, but that's another thing.
Was it during the pandemic?
Yes, that was a pandemic hobby.
Great. And so to just add a little bit for the audience, you guys have also spoken at a conference together, right?
Yeah, so Kat did help too a little bit with which one was it? I think it was, I've done a conference at APBA and CalABA, and then also with one of our other colleagues, Cindy, who if you've been listening to the podcast, she's been on here as well. One was a presentation about feedback and being able to give that feedback to supervisors, to supervisee, and vice versa, so that bi-directionality of feedback, and then also a presentation about the BCABA certification as well. So we're very passionate about the BCABA certification in general and why we think it's important for others coming up in the field to get it. So this will be a fun talk too.
Yes. Great. Now that's a great segue into, so just some of the references that we utilize to support in our talk today. We obviously tapped into the BACB website, particularly the BCABA handbook, just to get a general for our audience, to kind of give them a framework of the pathway to get to becoming a BCABA. And additionally, we did tap into an article research by LeBlanc, Taylor, and Marchese, called The Training Experiences of Behavior Analysts, compassionate care and therapeutic relationships with caregivers. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of like how it might relate to reasoning of becoming a BCABA. So I'm excited to learn a little bit about that as we dive into our talk, and even just the overall preparation and any additional trainings that you believe why this choice or this pathway was a good choice for you. So let's get started into a little bit of the research. The numbers are kind of, crazy. Even just you see these a lot. If you've attended any recent conferences within the last year, I'm sure you've seen this on one of the presentations where, our field is just growing so rapidly. So just to throw a little bit of numbers out. So this information was last updated in April of this year, 2024. BCBAs have been certified within up until this point at 68,006, and BCABAs at 5,000, and RBTs at 168,000. So just kind of throwing those numbers out, why do you think BCABAs hold such a smaller percentage in terms of the certifications that the BACB offers?
I think we talked about this at one point when Michael and our other colleagues were preparing their talk, because that was shocking to me. Like, why is that number so small compared to the others? But somebody made a good point, like, because you become a BCABA to become a BCBA. And once you become a BCBA, you stay a BCBA. So that BCABA number is never going to grow at the same rate as BCBAs. Your BCBA, we just keep adding. The BCBAs or BCABAs you add, then you take away.
Yes. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think too, a lot of students I feel like go from that RBT to BCBA pipeline, or sometimes not even having the RBT credential, and they go to grad school immediately after they do their undergrad, and then kind of get their hours and then sit for the test. So sometimes it's not a general requirement for them, so they kind of just go from either nothing to BCBA or RBT to BCBA. I feel like usually it is RBT to BCBA. I think it'd be a little harder just to go to BCBA, just because you do need those.
Jump.
Gosh, they're always changing the hours. It was 1,500, then now 2,000, and I think the 6th edition, which is coming out, that's still 2,000, correct? I should probably brush up on that.
Yeah, well, that brings a good point to our audience too. So anyone interested, right? It's like you really do have to kind of stay up to date. Thankfully, if you're, on the email list and you're already certified, you're going to get those kind of emails that give you a cue. Hey, an X amount in advance, usually at least a year in advance, maybe sometimes two. They kind of give you a newsletter that states, hey, the upcoming changes will be. So, it is sometimes hard to keep up, especially if you're kind of already through like that process of it. I mean, for me, I know I don't really go to the BACB website unless I'm recerting, right? So it's kind of like I also kind of had a refresh for this talk today. So you make a good point there too, is it is changing. So we should be, as up to date. We might have to add that refresher sometimes.
I think one thing too that contributes to these numbers, I couldn't find exactly like the specific state differences, but not all states are friendly to BCABAs. Not all insurances in other countries, or not countries, but states are friendly to BCABAs. So in certain states, I don't think you can practice as a BCABA, or you have to have additional credentialings. California is one, obviously, that likes them. I know, I think Texas and Florida as well, but not every state makes it easy to practice as a BCABA.
No, that's actually a really good point. So I had a friend who was a BCABA, and we were in a 3-tier model, and insurance this must have been maybe 2019, 2018. And they weren't like the insurance is still like, they didn't get indirect time. BCABAs didn't really have like an indirect code for themselves, or like they weren't incorporated within like, yes, that's the approved. So, I found it, just from observing from her experience, it was quite challenging even back then, just 4 years ago, to bill insurance, right? So like kind of how you mentioned, like them being states or even funders, right? Funding being friendly to the BCABA credential. And maybe also that's changed within time, because it does seem like, there is a little more give for that, but that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes into why there aren't as many I mean, that's what she was saying. My point was going to be that, when we're working together at one of our previous companies, we had a supervisor who was a BCABA before she got her BCBA, and she moved from a state that didn't allow billing for BCABAs in order to kind of bill and be able to get those supervision hours.
Yeah.
Um, in order to get that field work experience in California, just because we're one of the so few states that do allow that. And I think it is different across providers and just depending on who it is. I feel like that's a whole other talk in of itself. But I mean, it's nice that this state does allow for it and that we're able to get our experience that way. And I think that's probably why so many people go from that RBT to BCBA, just because that level of reinforcement isn't as high as getting that certification when you're going along the way, whereas they just want to get to that final goal.
Yeah. And just kind of looking at some of the graphs for the overall certificates per year in comparison to BCABA and BCBA. What I've noticed just within the last, probably since the pandemic, and I did kind of had like a note for myself, like, could this be pandemic related? Whereas the BCBA data is definitely on a continued incline on this graph. But for the BCABA, we actually see kind of a level out. So just kind of any insights that you might add of like why you think that is it, you think it is pandemic related, or what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it could be. I feel like it does go more to what Kat was saying earlier, where I think it could be people having that certification finally, or like, okay, let me go get my BCBA now. I think I was probably one of those numbers where I had my BCABA for a long time. I think I was credentialed from 2017 to 2023 just because I was kind of kicking the can of going to school. So I've had that
Okay.
under my belt for a while before I got that BCBA. And I feel like that number doesn't really reflect how many people go from BCABA to BCBA. So that could be another thing. But I mean, it could be pandemic related too, where, there's, or even just task list related, where people are like, it's not beneficial or it's not crucial enough for me to get before getting my BCBA.
Mm-hmm. And that leads me just to like kind of what you guys were saying. I wonder if the data is capturing, because let's see, it does have, I wonder if there's any decisions like on that in the middle where you're working on accruing hours, or like wondering about the length of time. And maybe if you can, do you think it's possible in a year to get the field work hours?
Yeah, I think, no, I think it took more than a year, but rough.
Did it around there. But I'm wondering if there are any that are just like on top of it and kind of get through it. So almost like the year data doesn't even capture them as the part that they've been in a BCABA. Does that make sense?
That would be interesting.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if maybe they transition quickly into a BCBA and maybe it doesn't cover some of that. So just kind of a thought I had probably. So yeah, just kind of giving a little bit, the audience a little bit of like what led you to wanting to become a BCABA. I don't know very many people that have pursued this. So not until coming to Joyscape did I realized, oh wow, there are a few that have gotten it. But other than my one friend from a few years ago at the other company, I didn't know anybody who had pursued their BCABA. So can you guys just give us a little bit of brief of like what led you to pursuing the BCABA?
I think that's really interesting, especially because Michael and I both worked at a different company where BCABAs were it was like kind of expected of you to become a BCABA, like that was part of the stepping stone. So I started out as an RBT, like most people in the field, BT, RBT, from 2016 to 2018. In 2018, I became a lead RBT. And so that was sort of like an entry-level, mid-level position. And so part of that was supervising RBTs, to helping train them on like client-specific protocols and things. And so it was at that point where I wasn't, personally, I struggled with school. So getting my bachelor's, I was not ready to go in for a master's program. I said, no, I like to take a break. I would maybe do a certification. So I was like, okay, I'll do a BCABA and stay there for a while and see how that feels. So that's what I did. I was certified in 2019. I was one of the last like cohorts that had to test in the testing periods, when you can only take the exams like every 3 or 4 months. I forget what it is now.
Yes. I remember the ages when
Yes.
That was a thing.
So my period was the very last one they ever did. So I took the exam in November of 2019. I found out my results in December. And then yeah, I stayed at BCABA up until last year.
Great. I was gonna ask something in regards to so well that I actually didn't think of that part. And someone who like for me, I didn't know a ton about BCABA. So that makes sense though, is that it gives you a little bit of time to adjust. Like I saw
Yeah.
it when I was, just kind of creating the outline for today of like, oh, it gives you time to adjust to becoming a BCBA. But also right? Like there is a thing as like school fatigue, like academia
Yeah.
fatigue, where you're just maybe wanting a break in between or really wanting to decide like, hey, is this something I want to pursue further, like going to get a master's, right? Because that's a large commitment, both time, financially, emotionally, right? So I think it also gives kind of that nice in between, which I hadn't thought before, for you to like settle into after graduating from your undergrad and, just settling into working full time and, not
Mhm.
having to do both, which I feel like a lot of us have kind of come accustomed to, like maybe working full time or working through school, so that is something to consider too.
Yeah, I think for me personally, it was so it's interesting too where Kat and I started, and I will say I'm very appreciative of the opportunities that we were able to get being at a three-tier model company, just because a lot of
Yeah.
people don't get the opportunity to kind of refine these skills before they become a BCBA.
Yeah.
And so she went the kind of RBT, lead RBT, then like the program manager route, and then I did the RBT, and then I got more involved into the training, recruiting, and hiring of the RBT level staff. And I think this kind of goes into maybe why there aren't as many BCABA certifications, because I think there's this misunderstanding where, I mean, not misunderstanding, I guess that it really is the name of the game in this field too, where it's like the RBT and the BCABA aren't kind of looked as into these lifelong career opportunities. It's kind of just your stepping stones until you get to that BCBA certification. So a lot of people are like, I'm not going to be stopping here. So kind of like, why bother? And so
Mhm.
for me, I was okay, like how can I move up a little more? So I was kind of hitting the ceiling about how far I could get ahead and do what I wanted to do in that position. So I became a program manager, let's see, maybe 2017. But I was still also trying to get my certification a little before I came into that role. So I was still training and hiring just because I think a lot of the trainings for RBT have to be signed off of a BCBA or BCABA for
Mhm.
those 40 hours. So that's why it kind of benefited me in that position. So I mean, I was a little under 3 years into the field before I decided to become a BCABA, which coincidentally enough in 2017 is when they started requiring that RBT. Well, when certain funders were starting to say like, hey, we're going to be requiring people to be RBTs in order to work with children. So it was kind of nice to have that very ABA 101 type class as I'm studying to take the RBT test and do that 40-hour training, because I feel like a lot of that went hand in hand on with what was tested on the RBT test. So that was nice.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I probably 3 years into it, and then I did the test in November too, like Kat did in 2017. And I remember having to wait like a full month for getting my results. And I think we probably learned maybe less than 5 days before Christmas. And I just
Yeah.
remember people are like, oh, the website's down, so it's probably all going out. And I remember one of my other friends, she had taken the test after I did, and she got her results saying that she passed. And so I was like, oh, great. Like I didn't pass. So I was like starting a spiral. And so like I kept on just rechecking the portal. And then I remember I was just joking with my friends, like, oh, I definitely failed. Let me just sign up for another test now and just get that over the way. But then when I checked where it says like status of your test, when you submit an application to take the test, it said status pass. And I was like, oh, thank God. It's like that whole month, and then you're like, okay, like it's either gonna like kind of make or like ruin my Christmas if
Right.
the certification. So it was funny just how I kind of found that out. And I had just accrued back. I think I sat under the fifth edition task list, fifth or fourth.
Okay.
I'm
It
pretty
was
sure it's the fifth.
transition.
I
Wow.
sat under the fifth edition, and so I I think now it's 1,300 hours you have to accumulate.
Yeah.
Then when I did it, it was 1,000 hours.
Yeah.
And so I had just gotten 1,000 hours, like maybe like the first week of November or like the last week of October. So I had to literally apply and just take whatever spot I could get because I didn't want to wait 3 months until I could sit for the test. So I signed up, and I think like the next open test was like in less than a week or two. So I was like, okay, I just have to take it and just keep on
Wait, so did you
studying how I'm
study?
doing. And luckily, like it worked out. So
Wow. So your study time was like minimal.
yeah, I mean, I was still kind of like studying, little by little, but really like crunch time, it was like a week, like 2 weeks at most, but it was a week. But thankfully, two other people were taking the test around the same time. So like we held study groups, but like it was definitely down to the wire.
Do or die.
Yes. And even doing it during the holidays, oh my goodness, I could not. Like the
Yeah.
anxiety of knowing I would get my results closer to the holiday would be like,
Yeah.
oh man. So at least
Yep.
it was good news though. That's the ideal
Yes.
situation. You could celebrate the
Yeah.
holiday, with that extra spunk knowing that you passed.
Hmm. I remember when I got the results, I got the email while I was in an in-home observing an RBT. And so that was the first person I told the RBT I was
Yeah.
thinking, I'm a BCABA now.
Wow, that's really cool. So kind of to go back to yours, so it's really actually interesting. So Michael, you went more of like the training route, and Kat, you had kind of a lead. So was that more like a program manager where you would just go on overlaps or support
Yeah.
in areas?
Yeah. The lead RBT was essentially like a program manager, not as, I mean, I wasn't doing like regular programming. It was more so overlapping the RBTs, assisting them with like protocols or how to do programming and like some, generalization and maintenance things.
Hmm.
So, program manager light, but
Yeah.
then once becoming the BCABA is when essentially I've been operating about the same as I am now since then. And I think that's one of the major things that I appreciate about being a BCABA is when I transitioned to being a BCBA now, it's like I've been doing this for a few years. Nothing was out of the blue. Nothing was that scary.
Yes, yes. No, and that's good for us to go into too, because it's just trying to determine like how was your training? Like it sounds like actually, I mean, you guys like accrued your hours and were able to sit and pass, but like how was it kind of getting up until that point before or during your accrual period? Like the supervision and the support from your fellow BCBAs, things like that. Like how would you kind of rate your overall experience there?
Um, I would say again, like Michael said earlier, in the company where I am really grateful for those positions that they had, being a lead RBT, um, because like the majority of my job was getting those unrestricted hours, things like that,
Yeah.
we were doing anyway.
Hmm.
So accruing hours was not difficult. And then that translated as well once, going for the BCBA, the majority of our job as a BCABA is doing what you're doing as a BCBA, except you're not fully independent. So accruing hours was easy. Transitioning to Joyscape when we do a lot more direct therapy, um, my unrestricted hours were so padded from my previous experience that it didn't matter. I could get all the unrestricted time here, and I was like, it worked out very well for me.
And
Yeah,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Michael.
no, I was gonna say I think the training, like, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong too, Kat, but I feel like we did get training more so to be a mid-level and like what it looks like to do supervision before we actually sat.
Yeah.
Um, so we definitely had that training experience, having our own caseload. What does it look like to go do an overlap? What are things we should be looking for? So it's really nice to kind of get that in a sense. And then we became certified. It was like, okay, I kind of feel a little more official. And then what is nice about having that certification that I don't think people kind of look into, it kind of prepares you just to kind of be a better supervisor. I feel like just because as a BCABA, you're able to do a lot what the BCBA does. So, I mean, I was doing a lot of like report writing, of course, like nothing finalized. It has to still be signed off by a BCBA, but report writing, depending on what assessments they were, I could help with assessments and kind of review them with
Yeah.
family and caregivers. and then just supervising the RBT as well. Just trying to basically how you can be a good supervisor, just because being an RBT, I think it is different because I'm always kind of like, okay, what did I get from my supervisors that I liked and what didn't I get that I wish I had? And then in that BCABA experience, you really do take on a lot of that supervision. So trying to, at least for me, trying to be the supervisor that I would want or that I would always want to have, and how I can kind of emulate that. Yeah.
And
Um,
how many supervisors did you guys have?
Many.
Okay.
Yeah. I think when I was getting signed off, I tried to minimize it just because the requirements for supervision just were so stringent. I mean, in a good way too, because they want to just make sure you're maximizing the most of your supervision. Because I think you had to have at least one direct face-to-face observation from a
Yeah.
supervisor, from every supervisor that's signing off for the hours every quarter. And then of course, like that 5% every month. Two are
Cool.
direct with a client. Oh, I should really read up on this. And then yeah, I think just that 5% with a two.
Mhm.
Yeah. But what I was going to say too is it just definitely helps you kind of prepare for the BCBA certification, because you're getting CEUs, you're having to log and keep track of everything. So it does prepare you in that sense. And then I think the 8 hours of supervision training that you have to go to in order to sign off on hours for RBTs is the same that BCABAs go through. So like I watched that 8 hour supervision module, and I was able to also get those 8 hour supervision CEUs, which was nice.
Yes. Yes.
Similarly to what you were saying about, how the BCAB role kind of like prepares you. I was looking a little bit at the BCABA handbook, and one of the things it pointed out in there, it said, following certification, most behavior analysts primarily perform unrestricted activities. It is important, therefore, to have experience with these activities before becoming certified. So before becoming a full-fledged BCBA who doesn't need any supervision from anyone, technically you could go out and practice and do what you will. If you, to me, it's a little bit you know scary if you haven't had a ton of practice with those unrestricted tasks. So working as a BCABA for a period of time, like you're doing that every day already with supervision, with BCBAs over you, monitoring what you're doing, giving you feedback, helping you learn and grow and develop a lot of the skills that the article was talking about, which I feel like was another major reason why it has been so helpful to have that certification. Because I can't imagine, for me personally, people do it and I love that for them, but for me personally, I cannot imagine going from RBT to BCBA. I don't think I would have done well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think another part of it too, which I'm just thinking about now, is a lot of caregiver training in that mid-level role kind of did fall a lot on our plate as BCBAs. I
Yeah.
mean, not the BCBAs were never there. I feel like they usually did check in where they're like, hey, do you feel comfortable doing this after they've kind of overlapped with us? But just that experience, because you don't really get that experience as an RBT, especially because,
Yeah.
their code, you have to make sure you aren't engaging in dual relationships and things of that nature, knowing what your scope of competence is. So being able to interact with caregivers and kind of get that experience as, a junior behavior analyst. I mean, technically like that behavior assistant behavior analyst, but just having that experience and being able to interact with caregivers from the jump definitely made me feel a lot more comfortable as a BCBA to kind of have like difficult conversations with families and
Yeah.
being able to kind of navigate those waters with them.
Yes. No, I love that. And those are pieces I think a lot of people might not know. Like I didn't even like think of that, but that makes a lot of sense. And that's why like your guys' insight is so helpful, just to see like those more intricate things that we might not think of. And that's also what the article that we'll discuss later kind of briefs on, is that the compassionate, empathetic approach and the training that we have as BCBAs, RBTs, more so BCBAs and BCABAs, where it's like we go through our grad training in particular, in addition to our field work, and we don't have have a ton of formal training embedded in what we've been through already, right? So that's a really interesting perspective there. One thing I want to go back is to some of the logistics that I was thinking about as you guys were talking, is what was the pay rate change? You could give a general, but like, was it financially worth it for someone who, you know, maybe kind of on the fence about pursuing their BCABA? I know you said within your last company it was kind of expected, but like for those RBTs that maybe, had good hours and wanted to kind of just stay in their role and maybe were preferring the jump to BCBA, what was that kind of like? Was there motivation for the change in pay rate, or what was the difference there?
From mine, it was a pretty big pay jump. I went and from like an hourly employee to salaried.
Okay.
So yes, the obviously wasn't as much as the BCBA, but yes, there was a big financial component for me because like this is short term, nice payoff. We'll see about the master's degree later.
And so did your company also pay for your certification?
They did have a
First,
program.
yeah.
I didn't do it, but you could have.
Yeah.
Nice. And then I know that there are a lot of agencies that kind of lock you in almost, or have you sign like a contract that kind of locks you in, because maybe there's been people in the past where they'll like, get the majority of the hours and then jump ship, right before they pass or right after. So was there anything that kind of locked you guys in to stay like after your certification, or that basically said maybe that you would have to compensate your company? Just kind of giving the audience a broad perspective of, some of the nuances, because the majority do work with children or families with autism. And this form of ABA or practice is the most common. So these might be some things that our audience has faced, or have questions about, that they don't really know who to go to.
Was it 2 years?
I don't remember if it was
I
2
don't
years or
remember,
1 year.
honestly.
But there was.
I
feel like
didn't
it
do
might
it.
have been like staying on with 2 years. And yeah, I honestly don't remember. But I mean, that's not uncommon where,
Yeah.
companies want to make sure that they're, I can see where it's coming from a business perspective, where they're
Right.
investing in you and they're investing their time and money. So I do think that is common. I feel like if it was 2 years, I was more on the side of, okay, like 2 years isn't that bad if I think about it in terms of like me staying. But I feel like I have heard some companies where they're like, oh, we want you to stay like 5 years. I was like, that feels like a
Yeah.
major commitment that I don't think I could do.
Or pay $7,000 for the super
Yeah,
you received.
exactly.
No.
Yeah.
It was an outrageous amount. So, there is that going around. So it's just, you're right though. You are still, it's an exchange, right? When you're looking at it from that perspective, it is an exchange. Sure, you might have to commit for a year or two, but that individual is going to have to weigh out their, the pros and cons, because like you guys are explaining, your training and the process to there in terms of preparing to become a BCBA seems like it was a really great experience, right? So that preparation and those 2 years were probably a nice, adjustment and kind of settle into the role and refine your skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we touched a little bit already on kind of the pathway towards, I did find it interesting as I was exploring the handbook, they have an overview of like those choosing their program. So can I ask, what did you guys go through your undergrad? Let's see, there's 2 pathways. I had to, again, also refresh my memory a little bit, but there's 2 pathways. So taking a course sequence, or did you get it within your undergrad?
I did the course sequence.
Same. Yeah, after undergrad.
Okay. And was that where was it through?
I did FIT.
Yeah,
I
we
think we
both
both
did
did
FIT. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice, nice. And did you feel like they prepared you well for the exam?
I think so. I mean, I passed, so I would say yes.
I think so. And so we both did that for our BCABA, but Michael and I did different schools for our masters. So I did FIT for my masters as well. And part of the graduation requirements for your masters and getting your BCABA is passing a final program exam. And
Yes.
if you don't, did you do FIT too?
I did not, but
Oh,
I honestly, I wish I had. Just
so
hearing
yeah.
about like the preparation that takes, like, yeah, it is very scary to think that you don't pass your program without that. But the pass rate is very good with FIT, right? So, again, some weighing out things of I don't feel I was super prepared after I
Mm,
graduated. So I had to invest in a lot of not just mock exams, but training programs. So, I do feel like I kind of wish I had made a different choice. And so I was reviewing some of the, overview criteria that in the handbook they kind of suggest, right?
hmm.
So I just thought that was interesting of like, oh, if I had, I was also navigating the path a little more solo and, doing that jump from an RBT to a
Yeah.
BCBA. So, and it was back in the day where actually I didn't need to be certified. So I was just a BT. They didn't have that requirement quite just yet, but it was definitely evolving into that fairly soon. But Michael, which master's program did you attend?
I did the I got my master's in education at Penn State University. So I
Okay.
decided to do the education route just because since I think I started, when did I start? In 2021 or 2022? It might have been 2021. It kind
I
of
think
blurs together, but
2021.
I decided to get my master's in education. I mean, not because I feel like I know everything about applied behavior analysis, but since I did my verified course sequence in at FIT, I had been in the fields for about 8 years. I was like, let me see what the education realm and what they do for that, and kind of see if I can get like a different insight, just so I could be a little. I feel like I like to be a little know-it-all, so I just wanted to know a little bit of everything, just so I can be like, okay, if parents have any questions, I should be able to answer it. Not that I feel like that way now, but I am glad that I just went a different route just so I can say I did something different.
Mhm.
Um, but I mean, when I did the verified course sequence at FIT, I thought it was super helpful in terms of, what I was learning. There was like weekly discussions on top of like the modules that you were doing. So it was very, for being remote and online, it was still nice to kind of see that face to face with like your teachers or the what were they called? They weren't the teachers who were running it, the discussion sections of classes.
Okay. Nice. And so yeah, that within there too. So did you guys take into consideration since you both went to FIT, you can talk about that the coursework sequence part or even for your masters. But they mentioned to focus on a few things to consider, which was size and the structure before choosing a program. So were those some things that you checked out, like number of faculty, university pass rates?
I would say for me, the things I focused on was that it was online. I could do it while working full time. And the FIT did have good pass rates. And so like the structure, yeah, online, it's not at your own pace, but you do the material on your own time, except for like your class meetings. And so that all sold me. And that is also why I did my master's with them too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel pretty similar where I was able to work and do school simultaneously. The pass rate was really good. And I think honestly, our company was kind of like, oh, suggesting the FIT route anyways. And I do think now that I say that out loud, I think FIT was in order to get reimbursed, like they had select places you could go to, and
Yeah.
FIT was one of them. But they recommended it just because, they've had other people that have done that program and kind of been promoted within the company. But also like that pass rate was pretty, influential on why they chose that as one of the institutions.
Yeah, I think what it used to be is you had to have your site approved to accrue supervision through FIT. That's what it used to be, and our old company was one of those sites.
Okay. Nice. I mean, I think it also makes a difference because you guys have such a great perspective, but also a positive experience with, particularly with like obtaining and the supports that were kind of already within the program you were in. So, do you feel like that made a lot of it, like a lot that contributed to your positive experience of kind of having it being kind of a norm stepping into that? Because I don't know, Like I feel like in the 3 tier I was in, like it wasn't the norm. So it was kind of someone
Mhm.
choosing to do that. And anytime an RBT was thinking, they're like, well, like you mentioned before, like why would I just go for the middle if I know I'm not going to stay at BCABA? I want to go
Right.
to BCBA. So let me just, dedicate my time to like have that more kind of straightaway path. But do you feel like the supports you had in place really contributed to that? Like if you were at a different 3 tier company where that wasn't common, do you feel like you would have made that same decision?
I think that's a good point. I mean, likely not. If the people around you or above you don't recommend it, don't think that's the route you should take, you might not, decide to do it. So I think we were very fortunate to be in a place that, kind of wanted us to pump the brakes a little bit and like get that experience and learn before you become fully independent, which I appreciate, but not everybody did.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is a huge factor in it too, whereas if it wasn't, promoted and we were told like, hey, this would be a good route, I probably wouldn't have thought to do it either. I mean, looking back at it, I think it's perfect though, because it's like I said, BCABAs can give that RBT supervision. And I feel like usually that's one thing that's kind of lacking. I mean, luckily for us, we worked at a center, so we saw a lot of people often. But I know at in-home that is so hard for RBTs to get supervision and that meeting that 5% every month. Whereas if you have that mid-level, you have that support in order to make sure they are getting supervised. Because I feel like everything kind of does trickle down. And I always say that RBTs are so crucial and so important to the fields. They're the ones really driving the success for all the families and caregivers. And they see that clients, I mean, I know we're a 1 tier model, but in 3 tiers and 2 tiers, like they're the ones seeing the clients more than the BCBAs are. So like if they're not getting that support and supervision, it's a little harder and it affects everything else.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like being that middle person, right? Because coming from my experience of being in a 3 tier that didn't have a BCABA, we did have some master's level students who were, program managers. But what is that like to be like a certified, just kind of that middle person who is certified, who can support the RBTs? Like, what was that like? Did you feel pulled in between um, supporting the RBTs and supporting with like programming and things like that? And to kind of chain off of that, what was your caseload? I think actually maybe let's reverse the order. What was your caseload as a BCABA? And then how was it like being kind of the middleman to support both ends, which would be RBT and BCBA?
I feel like I started taking clients on a little at a time just because I was coming from that training role. I
Oh.
actually did have a client. They gave me one client while I was still in that training role exclusively, just so I could get that unrestricted time. And
Mhm.
then I got the position, and then maybe like 6 or 7 clients, but slowly it kind of grew until like I think the most I had at one time was like maybe 15. I mean, all varying the dosage and time. So like some clients were 25 hours a week, some were like less than 10. So it kind of just depended on the clients and what the need was. The other question that you're asking, sorry, my ADHD brain, and I was like, wait, what was the other one?
No
Um,
worries about being the middle person and like, did you feel pulled some?
oh, the only time I probably felt pulled is just being at a center. Like there are so many ears and eyes on everyone that the RBTs also know that we're on site. So like if they're asking us for support, like of course I'm going to go in and support them as they need, just because I want to, retention's a big thing for RBTs. So I'm like, I definitely want to make sure you feel supported and not wanting to quit. But I think that was the only time, like if I was hunkering down and trying to do like maybe like a report or like update programming, like I'm very like it's hard for me to split my time sometimes. Like if I'm hyper focused on something, like I need to finish it. Otherwise, it's hard for me to leave and then come back to it. But in those moments, I definitely want to make sure staff feel supported. But in terms of like having that RBT supervision versus, doing like maybe programming or reports, it was nice being able to be a mid-level who was able to bill specifically for some codes where like I could have indirect time if I needed it and I could kind of hide away and do that. Or if it had to be direct, I could try and maybe plan to do 1 or 2 things in terms of like either programming or updating something while also supervising the RBT. And I think it helped because we had like RBT supervision forums that we use sometimes. and just knowing like what we can or like overlap forms that we use, so we can kind of know what to plan for, what we can do. I honestly, I feel like the biggest thing for me as a mid-level, which is probably the same now, would have been just making sure I do my notes on time. I think that was probably like the biggest one for me.
No, that makes sense. Some of those like things that you don't do like formal training on, but it's just like
Yeah.
those pieces are sometimes the most like tedious. Kat, I know you had a little bit of a different coming from already being a lead. So what was your caseload like?
So my experience was a little different than Michael's. So as a lead, I had a caseload from the get-go, and I want to say it was right around 11 then. So
Okay.
then when I transitioned as a BCABA, I think I had 14. And I think when I left that company, I had 22. Um,
Whoa.
so for me, that was one of the most difficult things. And it was a lot of clients, even though they had, different amount of hours. For me, it was a struggle, like, to see that, to support that many staff members. And then, like you were saying, with being that middleman, and this is why I love the company that we're at now as a BCBA. I'm there with my client and I'm seeing everything in real time, versus sometimes, as a BCBA, you're not there as much because you don't have as many hours with them. So on one hand, communicating with the BCBA, who's ultimately overseeing the case and ultimately like their word goes, and also with the RBT, who is there the majority of the time, and trying to communicate the differences that there might be, and juggling that as the middleman with a large caseload was difficult for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 22 is like upwards to where I also experienced burnout, and that was kind of
Yeah.
my exit to my last three-tier company. How many RBTs did you guys supervise while you were BCABAs, roughly?
I think at our company we probably had upwards of 50 RBTs, and like they did try and assign us like specific RBTs, or like the RBTs who are on our specific cases, like those are the ones that we're primarily in charge for. But I mean, there were at times where, someone's short for like 5%, and we know that it's not like we can be like, oh, like you're not under my, well, not on one of my teams, like I'm not going to give you that 5% supervision, just because like that 5% supervision is important. One, they should be supervised at that as a minimum anyways, but also it affects their RBT credential. So I mean, it was really like a team and really collaborative effort at that point, just
Yeah.
making sure they got that supervision.
So essentially, like all of them.
Yeah.
I know, I was just feeling like so 50, like
Yeah.
kind of just sprinkle. Wow, really?
And it was so much easier to supervise, of course, like the RBTs that were on site. So I definitely always felt for the RBTs who were like in home. And like I was saying, everything starts with them. Like the RBTs get the most amount of hours, and then as
Yeah.
mid levels, like we honestly probably got more billable hours for our clients than the BCBAs did, because usually like we're observing them for like quite a number of hours. So I think if a client was maybe like 30 hours a week, like I would at least be able to see them maybe 15, and like the BCBA was only watching them like maybe 3 to 5 hours a week. Kind of
Yeah.
just depends on what the client was landing at for the month. But I mean, it was definitely this collaborative effort, just letting the BCBA know, like, hey, like, I know you don't have this many hours. I mean, in the beginning, I feel like a lot of BCBAs are like, let's do this, this, and this. But as we kind of were more seasoned into our role, and then also as we were getting into that BCBA role, a lot of the BCBAs would be like, okay, like now what would you do, or what do you think is a good idea? And I'm really appreciative of that too, just because it's kind of like, okay, like I do need to be thinking in this kind of mentality, because I think I always joked with Kat where you're always asking like, oh, I need a grown up in the room. Like eventually, like you're gonna be the grown up that's in the room. So
Yeah.
like you kind of need to learn and have your wings and fly. So it's really good and to have that certification in that respect. And
Mhm.
I don't think that if I went from RBT to BCBA, I would have had a lot of that experience, or just even being able to accumulate those unrestricted hours. I know I always see a lot on the chats. It's so hard for RBTs to get that, whereas having that BCABA certification makes it super helpful.
Right. It's what you do all day.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, yeah. And I think for me, like I'm just learning from you guys too. And I think times have evolved where, like I said, my experience with, having a friend who was BCABA and just hearing the troubles that she kept on meeting where she would carry her own caseload. But it was so restricted. I mean, we at that time took anywhere from Medi-Cal to Kaiser to Anthem, Cigna, all of them. But at that time, there was maybe 3 out of those that she had indirect billable time.
Mm-hmm.
So there was really, but then she had a caseload of like, 12, right? So 3 of 12 is not a very good percentage, right? So you're trying to multitask. And again, we could do a whole other episode about, preparation of multitasking, scheduling, and some of those aspects of being a BCBA or BCABA and incorporating that within practice. Like that already is very challenging, right? You're trying to organize, you're trying to supervise and train other RBTs, and collaborate, right? Work with parents and caregivers. So there's so much different layers that go into our role that I think sometimes when we have those logistical challenges, it's not always a great experience. We're not always like prepped to do those things. So it's really great to hear, like times have also changed where they've been more understanding of what like a BCABA, the requirement, really. I mean, I wish now hearing a little bit more, you are changing my perspective on, wow, this is something we should be, talking about more and exploring this certification as an in-between for our RBTs who, making that huge jump is vast. So just like hearing your experience of how experienced you guys have been and the support you've received, I think that's a big thing too, is knowing
Yes.
like in that structure when you are deciding, do you have that support, right? Are all those other things in place before deciding that? Because I think that is definitely a defining factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also why like we've been excited to talk about this since we, have appreciated and like loved that we had that experience. And I would like that for more people, especially because I hear like the jump from RBT to BCBA and suddenly being the adult in the room is jarring. And like for me, that wasn't the experience. And I'm not a person who would have handled that very well. So I would love to see, more states, more insurances be more friendly to that position so people can have that transitional time, get the experience, develop those skills, and also ultimately like provide better quality care, particularly in this day and age when we're seeing a lot of criticisms for different things. I think that's a way to mitigate that. The more supervision experience you have before you're independent, hopefully the better quality services we're providing.
Yes. No, 100%, which actually reminds me, we're a little late on our code word, but, as it relates to this discussion that we just had, being the adult in the room, the code word for today's episode is going to be adulthood. Kind of just using that chain of, that transition sometimes is not always easy. So, some of those growing pains that we go through to kind of get to, you both are BCBAs now. So yeah, that'll be our code word for tonight. But as we transition into a little bit of like even some of the research we discussed, we touched a little bit about your training and your field work. So the BACB kind of mentions identifying supervisors and some of those qualities being modeled for, like the article mentions, compassionate care, empathetic care. Can you touch a little bit about what your training entailed as it relates to compassionate, even trauma-informed, right? Just those relationship-based approaches. What was your training like, both formal and informal?
Um, I think in like the course sequence, from what I remember, I don't remember there being a lot of that. Which, in reading the article, some of the numbers it throws out sounds very similar to me. Like 45% of people who responded said they encountered their training outside of behavior analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Like it said the majority of respondents, like 82%, said they often feel unprepared or not trained. And I would say like in the BCBA, the BCABA course sequence, that was probably similar. So the majority of my training, my experience with that came as working as a BCABA, working with my BCAs, dealing with these situations in real life, with someone standing there helping and guiding me. And that's another reason why I'm really glad I went that route, because at that time, I would say my BCBA coursework was different, but at that time there wasn't a lot of formal training for that.
Yeah, and I think the task list is slowly catching up to that. I mean, it's going to be in this task list now. And I think they included the last one, but I feel like I remember going through the fourth edition and not seeing like too much on that either. So I feel like, especially with trauma-informed care, that's been very, very new recently. So like in terms of having specific training on that, like I don't think that's ever been something that's been learning outside, how to kind of handle that, what we should do. And like Kat was saying, like those numbers like don't really surprise me that much either, just in terms of like what they're training or how people perceive their training. Just because I also know some like RBTs to BCBAs after they graduate and they get their certification. I'm thinking too, like how often do they know how to even just like play with a child? Like even that can be so awkward for some people, and it's not something
I
that's really like trained. You just kind of learn that in the field, and I think it does bring up a good point, like how the article was saying, like what can we kind of do to kind of facilitate the trainings that are needed, um, to make sure like BCBAs are ready. And I think it goes back a lot to just knowing what some of these soft skills are versus like hard skills, and like how to navigate those skills and just kind of even learn them.
Mhm. And just touching a little bit on what the article mentioned. So they were emphasizing the importance of relationship-based skills and formal training. They mentioned that if these things are not obtained, we have many, right, different obstacles that we might have to face, some of which include negative impact on treatment, parental non-support of treatment recommendations, requests for reassignment of clinician, which we know in turn can interrupt treatment in progress, and then ultimately requests to terminate services. So just kind of getting an idea of that. And the article references another study done on medical professionals who did establish strong relationships with their patients through using more compassionate care approaches. And the medical professionals themselves reported experiencing less stress and improved job performance. So, just kind of understanding too, like how these things can have that domino effect, right? And not only we're thinking we're being compassionate towards the families we work with, towards the children we work with, but also understanding how that can positively affect us within our day-to-day, right? Which like who wouldn't want that, right? That domino effect, and who wouldn't want kind of that chain reaction. So I think that was something that hit me too, is like, wow, that makes sense, right? But sometimes we don't always think of those aspects within the day-to-day.
Yeah, and I think it goes back. I think we're always trained on rapport building from day one with clients and the children that we work with, or whatever age they are. But that was never really taught to like rapport building with stakeholders or caregivers. And I know now and learning that outside of my coursework, it definitely does start like at assessment and making sure they're involved in goal creation. So it kind of goes back to that cultural humility and just really knowing what it is that they're wanting. And that's something that's not really taught. At least it wasn't when I was going through my BCABA coursework, but now I'd be curious to see if like that is something that's a little more embedded in the curriculum.
So I think again that speaks to the importance of when this wasn't required, because now in the fifth edition task list that started in 2022, which is the one I did my school under, it did require 30 hours of graduate coursework. So in FIT, that class was actually done by Dr. Linda LeBlanc. So I got lots of that with her.
Yes.
But if you went RBT, BCBA, you didn't have that coursework, you didn't have that learning, and it's up to you as a BCBA getting that experience to develop those skills. And that's a lot to manage, and I think it's just another reason why the BCABA can be really helpful, to give you the time, give you the experience to develop these skills, which can lead to less stress later on, which who wouldn't want that?
Exactly. So just a few things about kind of wrapping up. And I think the article is a nice and short one. It references a larger study done by Taylor et al. In 2018. So, just some kind of findings and solutions that they suggested. So a lot of it starts within the grad program, and being able to teach those things such as compassion, empathy, building therapeutic relationships, specifically with caregivers, but also suggestions for change within comprehensive training on core competencies of compassionate, empathetic care, kind of what you spoke to. It sounds like that is, evolving, right? So that's great to hear. We're still a relatively new field, right, in ABA. So it's really great to also be a part. There's like these growing pains still, but great to be a part of these changes and knowing that they are, on the horizon, and they are, embedding that within their coursework slowly but surely. Of course, we would love to see it across all grad programs. So that's something that is suggested. Another thing was embedding this into current curriculum, such as but not limited to ethics, elective courses, because, right, not all individuals that are pursuing their master's in psychology or education or what have you are going to go into working with children with autism or individuals with autism or developmental disabilities. But if there is an elective course, really embedding the compassionate approach within that. Also offering readings and attending workshops, as well as in including it within the just general required coursework. So just as we kind of wrap up, just any words of advice for any prospects that are currently RBTs and on the fence about pursuing BCABA certification, or maybe someone who is studying to become a BCBA as they do obtain the BCABA. But yeah, any last words of advice for anyone in the audience that, probably found this talk very helpful?
I feel like you should decide early on if you're going to take the BCABA route, just because I've met people who are like, oh, that would have been good, but like they're at like the tail end of their certification hours, so it doesn't really make sense for them to do the BCABA then BCBA. But I definitely would recommend it in the beginning, and you can definitely leverage that and use that to your advantage. If you are able to find a 3-tier company that has kind of spots for those certifications to be a mid-level who is certified. But I definitely loved my experience, and what I said earlier, just getting that experience of working with caregivers, that RBT supervision. And it definitely helps with the CEU research cycle, just because I already knew what I was doing once I recertified. And so I'm like in another cycle now. Like it just kind of, it's like riding a bike. I already know what to do. I think, we just have to get a couple more CEUs in each section and then overall. So it's not that big of a jump. Just so like by the time conference season comes around, like I know kind of how to get more bang for my buck in terms of like conferences and CEUs and going about that route. But I definitely do love and appreciate my experience as a BCABA. I was certified for like 6 years having it. So
Yeah.
I would say, being a BCBA is a pretty big responsibility. You are directly working with vulnerable populations and helping like shape their skills for the rest of their lives. And so when you're pursuing that, I would consider, going at your own pace. Like, don't feel pressured to go through it quickly and bust out your master's and, suddenly be independent. I would say to give it the care and consideration that it deserves. And maybe that means giving yourself extra time to be a BCABA and looking into that prior to, jumping into your program, because before you know it, you'll be the adult in the room again. And you might wish you had someone's hand to hold at sometimes.
Great. Well, thank you both, Michael and Kat, for coming on today. Such a wonderful feature with such valuable insight from the both of you, and you're hearing about your experience. So thank you again for coming on for today's episode. A reminder that if you're looking for a CE and took the time to watch this episode, go ahead and head over to joyscapetherapy.com to purchase your CE. Stay tuned for future CEs on our YouTube channel and socials for updated topics. And thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.